While Americans have lived every day with the consequences of the Joe Biden presidency, Europeans have felt these consequences as a more remote matter, even though they are actually closer to one of them, geographically speaking, namely the war still being waged on Europe's eastern doorstep. This remoteness makes many of them incredulous that Trump is back, and back with a vengeance. The things that many Europeans do not understand about Donald Trump could, if they were written down, probably fill a 5-volume set. But here I'd like to concentrate on three things, with the first two of these things being closely interrelated, namely Europe's post-historical nature, its moral purism, and its relative lack of positive visions. I shall treat them in this order. As I have written in various contexts, all of Europe, except the East, has been off the geopolitical stage of storm and stress for many decades now. I won't repeat here the full point about Europe that I have made from the point of view of the philosophy of history, but suffice it to say that European countries have ceased to be great historical powers, and that Europe's influence on world events is minimal. As a result, Europeans have forgotten that politics is, in its most heightened and extreme form, a matter of life and death. While no one in Tehran or Beijing particularly cares who sits in the Riksdag in Stockholm, or even in the Paris Élysée or in the Bundestag in Berlin, who sits in the White House in Washington, D.C., actually makes an enormous difference, since America is at an earlier historical stage than Europe is, and is still a great power. Like many people, I considered Trump's victory in the recent election to be the likelier outcome, but I was still nervous about the possibility of a Harris upset. And a German friend of mine told me to relax, saying that, after all, it's only politics. And I pointed out to him that in his country, politics is indeed only politics, while in my country, the United States, politics is a matter of life and death around the world. And I reminded him that because Trump lost in 2020, Russian forces were encroaching upon Eastern Europe with deaths well in excess of 100,000. Over 1,000 Jews were slaughtered in Israel, and Afghan women were enslaved and Afghan gays stoned to death. That is to say that many Europeans, because they themselves or their continent, their countries, no longer exercise world influence, they have forgotten that the world needs a strong America to hold things together. Having forgotten this, it is easy to concentrate on lesser things, such as Trump's sometimes crude jokes or perhaps other seemingly offensive remarks. Now, personally, I find very little of what the man has ever said offensive, and I think that we've grown far too sensitive, but that'll be a discussion for another time. Worrying about a leader's meanness or gruff ribaldry is a luxury that post-historical peoples have, historical ones do not. But if Europeans, and the segments of the American left who think as they do, were to remember what is actually at stake in American elections, they would understand that a rambunctious tough guy type is a far preferable choice for America and the world, even for Europeans themselves, than is an insecure woman whose weakness was matched only by her monumental cluelessness and obvious lack of intelligence. So when my European friends go to vote, they vote for marginally lower tax rates and, in vain, for reducing the speed at which new mosques are being built in their countries. When I go to vote, I vote for peace in Europe, I vote for stability in the Middle East, and I vote for the hemming in of China's imperialistic ambitions. This stark difference for the world, and also for that matter for domestic American politics, based on who controls the American presidency, should also be a reminder for the conspiracy theorists, both left and right, who think that the deep state or blob run absolutely everything, and that the American president just takes orders from global moneyed interests. While these interests no doubt do exercise great influence, and in this case, in fact, Europeans have an even more valid complaint than Americans do, and while I certainly hope that Trump's efforts to cut down the deep state will be successful, to pretend that the president himself does not decide major questions of life and death is ridiculous. Related to the post-historical factor is that of moral purism. Being post-historical and having little geopolitical responsibility because of a dearth of geopolitical power, make moral purism not only tempting, it's always tempting since it feeds our vanity, but they make it the actual norm. Just as so many people judge historical actions from the advantage of hindsight, not having to confront the stress and uncertainty that historical actors had to face in their moments of decision, so too post-historical peoples are able to point at powerful contemporary geopolitical actors and tell them what is right and what is good. But those who have real responsibility tend to understand that moral purism is impractical. Biden did not understand this, which is part of the reason why the world, during his presidency, grew increasingly chaotic. Trump, on the other hand, in ending the war in Ukraine, which he will, understands that while moral purism may dictate that Russia is an evil imperialistic aggressor and should be pushed back, only practicality can bring peace to Eastern Europe. To resolve a stalemate that was increasingly tilting in Russia's favor, the matter can be acceptably solved only by a peace agreement that, on the one hand, will leave our moral urges unsatisfied, but that, on the other hand, will render the world less chaotic. Implicit in such an agreement will be the notion that might does, up to a point, make right, because Russia will, through brute force, have achieved some territorial gains. But acknowledging that such is the world in which we live is part of bringing about peace, and a practical leader like Trump will make such an outcome possible, while post-historical and morally purist Europeans complain that such an agreement is tantamount to rewarding a brutal dictator. They would rather see continued death and destruction than leave their thirst for moral superiority unquenched. Moral purists will do a lot of hand-wringing over this or that moral conundrum, and as the case may be, this is sometimes understandable. But practicality has a different mind. Practicality understands that sometimes negotiation with brutal men is necessary, and sometimes overwhelming power and the suffering of innocents is necessary in order to achieve peace or stability. Europeans can easily point fingers and say that such and such would be better, and accuse Trump of callousness or cruelty. But the reality that always rests on the shoulders of a world leader with actual power will dictate more clearly that, as always, Machiavelli was right. Moral purism feels good. It is a type of drug, a luxury item that men with responsibility cannot afford. A final thing Europeans do not understand about Donald Trump and about American conservatism more broadly is the positive vision. Contemporary European conservatism is more reactionary and less rooted in something positive, in no small part because religion is so much weaker in Europe, even by and large among conservatives. When one listens to many conservatives in Western and Northern Europe, they so often, understandably enough, focus on the Islamization of their countries, on their societies growing less recognizable, and on resisting overbearing legislation from the EU bosses in Brussels. Now, these are worthwhile causes, of course, but they often come at the expense of formulating positive visions of the world and of what a better society looks like, such as through the embrace of family, faith, and local communal bonds. Such concerns often seem dangerously nativist to squeamish Europeans, and a genuine belief in Jesus as the anointed Son of God will draw amused smiles even in many conservative circles. Although Trump himself is no typical conservative in the religious sense, of course, the American conservative movement that he, justifiably or not, has come to represent does not suffer from this squeamishness. Rather, it unabashedly proclaims what it holds true. It proclaims America's superiority to the rest of the world. It is proudly armed, and with positive naivete, it raises the cross for all to see. And this is, in fact, willy-nilly inspiring to people. And so Europeans fail to see that it is precisely the unabashed and positive triumphalism characterizing Trump and American conservatism more broadly that can achieve the results that some Europeans themselves desire, but do not know how to bring about. This authenticity, or unvarnished honesty, is something that Americans love, and so many Europeans fail to comprehend. Trump happens to intuitively understand the truth of one of my favorite lines from de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. They, the rich, voluntarily give to the people, but they wish to continue to keep them at a distance. They believe that this is enough. They are mistaken. It is not the sacrifice of their money that the people demand from them, but of their pride. Trump openly brags about his wealth, and lower-class Americans are fine with that. They love him because he speaks to them forthrightly. In other words, because he treats them with respect. This is in stark contrast to almost every Democrat, and even many Republican, not to mention European major politicians, and not least Trump's opponent in the recent election. European conservatism does have one advantage vis-à-vis American conservatism, namely that the latter has liberalism baked into it in a way that the European variety does not. America was founded on rebellion against the king and on the Declaration of Independence, which itself has liberalism in its opening wording. That is, a European conservative sentiment like "for king and country" has no strength in the United States. And so European conservatism is technically capable of being more conservative than American conservatism, and one sometimes sees this in small conservative pockets in Europe. European conservatism can thus potentially be very deep, but it is very narrow in its reach on the continent, while American conservatism must necessarily be shallower, but is on the other hand far broader in its reach. But so, even though European conservatism does have this theoretical depth that is unavailable for American conservatives, who are more liberal for the reasons I stated, the latter are still much more successful in their battle for recruits due to their embrace of a clearly defined, positive worldview. While Europeans have a deeper well available from which to draw in their combat against left-wing and Islamic encroachment, they have evolved too far away from the, in their eyes, childish and naive behavior of someone like Trump. They don't realize that so much of his success, not just in terms of elections, but also in terms of executed policy, stems precisely from that which they deplore, namely the cutting of the Gordian knot of propriety, accepted custom, and geopolitical niceties. Those Europeans who shake their heads in disbelief at Trump and his success would do well to consider things, including themselves, from an American and, even more so, a global point of view. Remembering the factors I have discussed, the post-historical nature of their condition, their moral purism, which is undergirded by so many unexamined philosophical premises, and their lack of concretely defined positive visions for the future, would make Europeans better understand, even if not always agree with, the phenomenon of Donald Trump, and why he, and the America he leads as of today, act the way they do. Thank you.